Good evening. It's good to be back with you here again tonight. After this evening's lesson, we'll be 3/4 of the way done with our gospel meeting, at least in terms of sermons. That's 6 out of 8 sermons after tonight is finished. And so the week's gone by pretty quickly here. I've enjoyed the beautiful scenery of Wooster, Ohio. I'm a little worried about tomorrow, though. The frost's going to kill everything. All these beautiful budding trees and all of the flowers that we see growing. I know how concerning that is. My family runs a U-Pick farm in Indiana where we have blackberries and blueberries and strawberries. And so when there's a late frost coming on, you're always worried that it's going to kill off some of your plants. So it's good to be here with you tonight. If you're visiting with us, we appreciate you being here. Tonight, probably mostly the home crowd, I'm assuming. But I want to think with you tonight about one of the lessons we were going to do last night. We flip-flopped a little bit from last night to tonight. We've talked this week about lessons from Jesus. We're preaching Jesus, literally taking teachings of Jesus and trying to learn more about what he said on certain topics. And tonight, I want to think with you about Jesus on the topic of materialism. In our series this week, we have looked so far at what Jesus has said about sinners. We looked at the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15 on Sunday. We've talked about Jesus and authority last night. We're going to talk about Jesus and on the subject of obedience tomorrow night. We're going to talk about Jesus on the subject of eternity on Friday night. We're going to look at the lessons that Jesus teaches in Matthew 7:24 through 27 about the wise and foolish builder. But tonight, in tonight's lesson, we're not just going to pick one passage out. The reason why is because Jesus has talked so much about money. He talks so much about materialism. It's hard to just pin this down to one passage. Did you know that Jesus talks 10 times more about money and materialism than he does baptism? And yet you've probably heard more lessons on baptism than you have on money and materialism with Jesus. Jesus talks about money a lot. He talks about material things a lot and our attitudes toward those things quite a bit. And so we're going to look at several of the passages where Jesus has addressed this issue, and just want to take with us a few points of consideration. Hopefully, all of you were able to receive this sheet. This is an interactive outline. It just helps you follow along. If you want to fill in the blanks while you go, that helps some people. Sometimes it gives you something to take home and study so that you can check what I'm saying and make sure that what I'm telling you is the truth. Sometimes you might take this and try to teach somebody else. I certainly have been to a lot of gospel meetings, and like Brother Swaino back there, maybe, I take what I hear and I recycle it a little bit. Freely I received and freely I give. And so there's nothing wrong with that either. It's not original with me. Hopefully it all comes from here anyway. And so, I encourage people to use these in personal studies with others and in preaching and teaching as well. So the first thing we want to do is we want to define materialism. The reason why is we're going to be using this term throughout this lesson. So what exactly is materialism anyway? Well, the word Jesus uses for what we might call materialism, because you don't actually see Jesus using that particular word, at least not as it's translated to us in English. But a word that he does use is the word mammon in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. Take a look at Matthew 6, because that's going to be one of the first passages we're going to go to anyway. We'll spend a lot of time in Luke after that. But in Matthew chapter 6 and in verse 24, right before Jesus begins talking about worry in this text of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Well, that's at least how it reads in the New King James Version. Now, there's other versions that translate it differently. But this word mammon is defined by Thayer's Greek English lexicon as, well, mammon. But secondly, it often refers to treasure. Okay? A third definition might be riches. And the idea of these riches is they are personified, they are opposed to God. You cannot serve God and your treasures. You cannot serve God and your riches. You cannot serve, since riches and treasures are material things, you cannot serve God and then be loyal also to those material things. Anything, if we think about materialism, anything that we can covet on earth as a material thing can become our mammon. In the 10th commandment that you read about in the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17, I think the explanation of things that aren't to be coveted is a pretty good description of some of the things that people might covet that are earthly material things that they shouldn't be focused on. Look at Exodus 20 and verse 17, and it says there, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house." That's a material thing. Don't covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. She's a material thing as well. Sometimes we can get to thinking, oh, I wish I had that house. Oh, I wish my wife was more like that. Don't covet his male servant, his workers. Oh, I wish I had some workers. Wish I had some servants. Don't covet you. That's a material thing. Nor his female servant, nor his ox. Now today we might covet a tractor. Or we might covet a lawnmower. We're not using too many. There's some people out here that are using ox, perhaps, but there's not too many people where I'm from that are using ox and horse to plow and to garden their fields with. But he says, don't covet his ox, don't covet his donkey. That's, again, a work tool. And don't covet anything that is your neighbor's, any of his material things. These are material things. And so the reason why I like to point that out is because sometimes we think of materialism just in terms of money. It's not just money that we're talking about when we talk about materialism. Materialism can be certainly much broader than that. Take a look at Colossians chapter 3, where the Apostle Paul mentions the idea of covetousness. And notice the context in which he mentions it. He says in verse 5, "Put to death your members which are on the earth." And what are those members we are to put to death? Fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Okay, covetousness is idolatry. Anything that we idolize that begins to take priority over God can become idolatry. And covetousness says is idolatry. Sometimes it's our desire for money, material things. Some have suggested that the things we're coveting might be the fornication and the uncleanness and the lewdness. It might involve other people. 1 John chapter 2 would certainly include that idea. In 1 John chapter 2, look at how John might phrase this. 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17. As we turn over there, it says this. It says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world." Again, that's earthly things, the world as in things here on earth. Don't love those things. We have to use those things. We might need some of those things. But he says, don't love those things. Don't let those things become a priority in your life. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. All that is in the world. Well, what does that include when it comes to the world? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, okay? Lust of the flesh, physical things. Lust of the eyes, things that we can see. The pride of life. I like to talk about the braggadocio of life. Some have used that word pride and used that word. Things that we might brag about. Our degrees, our education, our careers, the alphabet soup behind our names. Those are things that speak to our pride. If you're a younger person, I've got a daughter that plays soccer, for example. The awards that you might win for playing a sport that make us brag, or we brag on our kids. I've got another son that works, and he comes home and they promoted me again, and they gave me this badge today, and I've got this badge. It's the pride of life, and that's cool. That means he's working hard. So I'm not trying to talk down about that, but some people let that become their focus. They become materialistic in that sense. It says, here's why you shouldn't let that be your focus. It says, because the world, verse 17, is passing away and the lust of it. Because everything here on earth isn't going to stay. It says, but he who does the will of God abides forever. That's why that needs to be our priority, not material things. And so based on these passages, we've got to be on guard for a mindset which idolizes the pursuit of material things. Well, how can we do that? How can we be on guard, watching for what a materialistic mindset might look like? So I'm going to show you 5 things from 5 passages from Jesus that I believe indicate to us some of the byproducts of a materialistic mindset. Here's number 1 for you. How do I know that I have a materialistic mindset about something? Well, when our life's investment is in material rather than spiritual endeavors, then that's an indication of a materialistic mindset. Take a look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. Here's where we're going to go with that Matthew passage. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. None of these are going to be up here on your screen today, so I just encourage you to get out those old paper Bibles. When I hear you turning along with me, it tells me that you're still paying attention, and that way you can check and make sure I'm telling you what's right. Matthew 6 and verse 19 says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. That's material things, where moth and rust destroy. Okay, so what does moth and rust destroy? Well, back in the first century, moth and moths would destroy clothes, right? A moth gets in your clothes and eats through it. That's a material thing. What does rust destroy? Rust would destroy your coins. You might eat through some of your coins. They might begin to rust, so your money. And so don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. What do thieves break in and steal? They steal your material things. They steal your clothes. They steal your money. They steal your stuff. Today, thieves come in and they steal your TVs and they steal your iPads and they steal your cell phones and they steal your guns. If you've got those stored away somewhere, they'll find those. Those are material things. It says, don't lay up for yourselves those things, but verse 20, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, this is a simple 3-verse passage, but it teaches us some really simple things. The first thing that it teaches us is that you have a choice whether you will make your chief pursuit in life material. When we talk about material, we're talking about coins, we're talking about cars, we're talking about trophies, we're talking about medals, we're talking about degrees, we're talking about houses, we're talking about property and land, stocks and portfolios. You have a choice in life whether that's going to become your chief pursuit or whether your chief pursuit is going to be spiritual, kingdom work, church-focused work. The work of using our resources for the benefit and good of others and not just ourselves. Heaven. Now, how do I know which decision I should make? You know, because the American dream is all about prosperity and the white picket fence and having the 2-story house and having that flat screen TV on the wall. I mean, the American dream is having all those material things. And so I've got America telling me one thing and I've got Jesus telling me another. So how do I know which one is the right decision to make when it comes to what my pursuits are? Well, we make the same decision about this. I would suggest to you that we make when we do make material investments. The worth and value of an investment is seen in its return. What's the return? Well, the return, if you've invested in material things, is that when you die, you're not going to take any of it with you. And you might lose a lot of it before you die. Right? Your degrees, after you're gone, what's that going to matter? It's going to get put in a box somewhere. Might get thrown away and trashed. It's not going to be worth anything after you're gone. Your trophies from all the sports you played and all the achievements that you had, what's going to happen with that? Your grandkids want to put your trophies up on their dresser? No. It's going to get trashed. It's going to get put in a box, if that. Your cash, it's going to be given away to your kids and your grandkids. And to the government. Your cars, they're going to get auctioned off. And all that time you spent fixing your car and paying for your car, it's going to be auctioned for pennies on the dollar someday. House is going to be sold. Property is going to be inherited. But if my pursuit is spiritual, then those are eternal riches that I'm going to enjoy. They're going to last forever. Heaven is forever. Heaven is eternal. I'm always going to get to enjoy those things. And so which one has the better return on investment? Spiritual things. Now, where we invest our time and our treasures and our talents is going to determine, I think this passage also teaches, where our heart's focus lies. Take a look at verse 21. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So do you treasure material things or do you treasure spiritual things? How do I know which one you treasure? Here's how I know which one you treasure. Based upon what your heart thinks about and dwells on the most. If you're someone who's really into sports, then what do you think about a lot? You think about your favorite sport. If you play sports, you think about practice, you think about the game you've got coming up, you think about how you want to win the championship, win the tournament, win the next game. If you're someone who's like me, used to play sports in the past, but I'm getting too old for that stuff now, you might think about your favorite teams. And so you're thinking about your favorite teams, and so you're turning on the channel, seeing how your team is doing, watching the game. You invest yourself in a team, you invest yourself in a sport, then you think about that. You dwell on it. You meditate on it. If music is your thing, then you might spend hours and hours practicing your music and working with your band or your choir, things like that. If your career is your main focus, then where is your heart? Well, you're going to be thinking about your job. You're going to wake up thinking about your job. You're going to go to sleep thinking about what you got to do tomorrow. You're going to be thinking about those bank accounts and what those 401ks look like. That's where your heart is. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. But we can also spend a lot of time thinking about spiritual things. We can invest in that. We can think about that long list that we just heard before services. How's Brother Klein doing tonight? Maybe we should check on him after services. How's Pat going to do tomorrow? Maybe I should check on her tomorrow night, make sure she's doing okay. Other people that aren't here. Brother so-and-so lost his job. Maybe I should check on him and his family and see how they're doing. I'm interested in God's people and God's family. And when my heart is with the church and is with God, and it's also going to be with his people, I'm going to invest myself in that. And that's the idea, I think, that Jesus is trying to get across. We know where your treasure is when we realize what your heart talks about the most. Show me your investment of time. Where do you spend the most time in your life and in your day? Show me your checkbook and where you spend the most money, your treasures, and I'll show you where your heart is. That's what Jesus is saying. So when our life's investment is in material things rather than the spiritual endeavors, it indicates that we might have that materialistic mindset. Look with me to the book of Haggai for a moment. Haggai chapter 1, verses 3 through 9. I just want you to see something that the prophet Haggai said to the people of God. It says in verse 3, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses and this temple to lie in ruins? What do you think Haggai asked that question? It's kind of interesting. Well, the temple was lying in ruins. It needed to be rebuilt, and the people of God weren't doing it, even though they had been released from captivity, so they could go home, and so they could do that, but they'd stopped doing it for a time. And yet, interestingly enough, their houses look great. He says, you've got nice paneled houses. You guys are doing very well when it comes to your own home, but the temple is falling apart. What's his point in saying that? He says, I can tell that your priority is on you and not on the work of God. And he asks them as he continues through this prophecy that I want your focus to be more on the priorities of God and less on your personal priorities. Because your priorities are flip-flopped. They're on material, not on spiritual things. I've seen church buildings where there are things in church buildings, in decor in church buildings, that there are members in those church buildings, they would never let that slide in their own homes, right? We want our homes to look good. We want our floors to be a certain level. We want everything to look good. I'm not saying our focus should be on the physical building, but shouldn't we care as much about that, at least, as we do our own houses? Let our focus be on spiritual things. Certainly God's people is part of that. Let me notice the second thing with you. We're going to be here all night. When we allow our covetousness, the second byproduct of a materialistic mindset is when we allow our covetousness to divide and to destroy. Look at Luke chapter 12. And here Jesus says something else in this passage that Luke records. It's a really short section, verses 13 through 15, but it says, someone from the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Now, it's interesting how Jesus responds to this, because you know what? Jesus doesn't respond to everything. There's a good lesson there. Jesus realizes some things just aren't my business, and I'm not getting involved in that. There's some wisdom there. You don't have to get involved in every single issue that takes place between brethren or families. Verse 14 is where Jesus says, Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? This is not my business. I don't want to stick my nose in this. However, he does say something about the fact that this individual would interrupt him mid-sermon to ask him to settle an inheritance dispute. He says, here's something I will say, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. What does he notice about this individual? He's saying, you're materialistic. You're not thinking about the spiritual lessons that I've just shared with you. Instead, you're thinking about getting your fair share, your fair cut of an inheritance issue. You're focused on material things. And we sometimes can allow our covetousness, our focus on material things, to divide and destroy. Let me give you a few examples of that. We are to beware of what covetousness can produce. What did it produce with Adam and Eve? Well, when Eve desired the forbidden fruit, it caused a divided marriage. The two of them, after they partake of the forbidden fruit, are bickering with one another and casting blame upon one another. Covetousness can cause that in a marriage. It produced sibling rivalry with Jacob and Esau. Jacob lies in order to receive some of the inheritance. What happens today when we're covetous and we're dishonest about the inheritance, or we try to deceive to get a bigger cut of the inheritance? Well, we have sibling rivalry issues. We have fights in families. You know, I did a funeral one time, and this has happened a couple times, where I've done funerals, and in the back room, right before the funeral, the kids are arguing about inheritance stuff instead of honoring the memory of their mom or dad who's just passed away. That's pathetic. I did a funeral once where they were afraid family members were going to come rob stuff out of the house, and they had to have a security guard stay at the house to make sure nobody stole stuff while they were at the funeral. What does covetousness do? Covetousness causes that type of action to occur. Shameful. When David coveted Bathsheba, destroyed a family, destroyed a marriage between Bathsheba and Uriah. It destroyed a family when Achan coveted an Ai. His whole family dies because they're accomplices to Achan's sin. They know what he has hidden in that tent. And so they didn't say anything. And you put your family in a bad position when you're covetous, and you ask them to be quiet about it. It destroys the disciple when Judas betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. How many betray Jesus out of some material benefit that they seek? Covetousness and greed has the power to divide and destroy us. Let me notice a third thing with you. A third byproduct of a materialistic mindset is when we leave God out of our plans and our budget. Take a look at Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. So Jesus continues this thought of covetousness, and that's where he offers the parable of the rich fool. So if you're still there in Luke, verse 16 says, "Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?" By the way, what's covetous? What is materialism here? It's crops. It's not coins, it's not money, it's actually crops, which he could sell for money, of course. And so he says, I don't have any room to store my crops, so I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods, and I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. I've done really well with my life. I'm ready to retire, is the idea, and I'm just going to live in luxury. But God says to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you, and then whose will those things be which you have provided? All the barns, all the crops, all the goods, they're not going to be yours anymore. God says you're going to die tonight, and so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now notice, I don't think God is condemning, Jesus is condemning wealth or prosperity here. He's condemning wealth and prosperity that is used primarily for yourself without any concern with how God wants you to use it. This man, the rich fool, has clearly left God out of his plans for what he would do with his stuff. When you leave God out of your plans, you're probably leaving other people out of your plans as well. Why? Because God wants us to love him. He also wants us to love our neighbor. And if you're not willing to do God's will, you're not willing to help your neighbor, it's an indication that you're self-centered. I believe the rich fool was very self-centered. You know how you tell a self-centered person? They say I a lot. They say me, my. Look at the pronouns here. You're not going to find hardly a section of scripture where I, me, and my is used more often than in these 2-3 verses where he's talking about himself. He's self-centered. He never thought for a minute about God as he made his plans. He just thinking about him. He assumed his purpose was to live for himself. And there's a lot of people who think that way. I'm going to get mine. I'm going to make me happy. I'm the one that gets the first cut, rather than the God who gives life. So many people think this is the good life, but when we do so, we show a lack of spiritual mindedness. We rob God of the glory that he deserves. And so I would ask you, is God in your budget? My younger brother, he was looking to buy a house at one point in time, and he said, how do you go about figuring out how much house you can afford? I said, well, you need to create a budget, right? You need to have an understanding of how much you're spending in various areas. And so I just went through things. I said, tell me what your budget looks like. How much do you spend? How much is your car payment? How much is your insurance? How much is your utilities going to be? How much are all these things? And he went through all these things. And he said, well, okay, I think then I could afford it. And I stopped him. I said, I got a question though. You left something out. You didn't say anything about contribution, because that's a big chunk of change for me. It's a percentage of my income that I try to give back to the Lord, and you didn't even mention that, and that's going to perhaps take a bite out of what you can afford in terms of a house. Oh yeah. We can tell whether or not you have God in your plans when we see that it's in your budget. And with the rich fool, God was not in his budget, or God's people, or anybody else but him. It was all about him. we can tell how interested you are in God by how you divide your screen time. You pick up that phone, you look at it, how much of that is for spiritual things? I don't know what your screen time is. My phone tells me every week what it was on an average every day, but how much of that time were you spending texting other members of the church, reading your Bible app, things like that? Or was it all about just things you were interested in? Or were there others involved? So is God in your checkbook? Is he on your bank statement? Is he part of your screen time? Can we tell by your words? I want to ask you a question. If you were going to rob somebody, who would be one of the dumbest people to rob? Have you ever thought about what would be some of the dumbest places to rob? Speaking of screen time, if you ever get a chance, look up dumb robbers. Just Google it, all right? Because there's some funny ones out there. I'll tell you a few things for me. I wouldn't want to go rob somewhere that had high security cameras all over the place, would you? It's not very smart because they're going to see me. They're going to identify me. They might see my car. So I wouldn't do that. I saw one guy that robbed a bike in front of a police station. If I was going to rob a bike, I probably would not go in front of a police station to do it. And they arrested him right there. I wouldn't go try to rob a Navy SEAL who looks like Rambo, you know? That's just not the guy that I'm going to pick on if I'm trying to rob somebody. I'm not going to rob Chuck Norris. I'm not messing with him, okay? Take a look at Malachi chapter 3 so that you see where I'm going here. Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. This is what Malachi says in verse 8. He says, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me." He says, "You say, in what way have we robbed you?" He says, "In tithes and in offerings." Now, I know. The New Testament doesn't require that we tithe. In fact, the New Testament actually requires that we give above and beyond the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, which would be beyond tithing, wouldn't it? But I want to ask you, if you're going to rob somebody, you wouldn't rob any of those people or any of those places. And yet we have a God who is all-knowing, a God who is all-powerful. And Malachi says some of you are foolish enough to rob him. Giving needs to be in your budget. And when we leave God out of our plans and out of our budget, it indicates that perhaps we're thinking too materialistically. Let me notice another thing with you that Jesus mentions on this topic in Luke chapter 14. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. While we're turning there to Luke chapter 14, I do want to say I appreciate the hospitality of so many this week. I was able to eat with the DeVores for lunch on Sunday, and Sister Eileen, maybe some muffins. I'm going to her house tomorrow if the Lord wills. And so there's been people here. Pat's probably worn out. I'm surprised you're awake, Pat. I'm surprised you're not having to get nudged over there because she's been cooking all day long. And the DeVores again last night. Tenny's on Monday. So people have been very hospitable, and I truly appreciate that. I don't exactly have an oven in my hotel room, so I appreciate y'all cooking for me and providing in that way. But in Luke chapter 14, Jesus says something about hospitality. He says in verse 12, he said to him who invited him, "When you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just." You know, when we were first married, my wife had a couple of those pampered chef parties, and maybe you've seen those, right? The pampered chef, and they have all kinds of parties like that, right? The jewelry parties and things like that. And we did a couple of those, and I said to her after the first couple ones, you said, I don't like those. I don't. I hope I'm not. I don't mean to step anybody's toes too hard here, but I said I don't like inviting people who you feel like are going to give money because you're going to be able to get more pampered chef stuff out of it. So I don't like that. I don't like inviting people to my house, and so we don't do it anymore. We don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Because I feel like you're cherry picking who you're going to invite. Because there's some people who can't afford it. You're not going to invite them. And I read this verse and I said, you know what? I feel like that's exactly that situation. So we're just not going to do that anymore. And we don't. There are people, I've heard this before. There are people who are kind of networkers. They're in the financial fields. And they go to churches specifically because that's the church you want to go to if you're going to network with people for business. If that's how you think about church, is you're looking for the church where you can network with people, then you got a messed up idea of what the church is all about. That's materialistic. That's exactly what Jesus is condemning here. People who you'll be friendly to because you know you can get something back from them. That's sinful. That's a materialistic mindset. Matthew 5 verse 42 says, give to him who asks you, asking for nothing in return. Help people because they need help. Not always because you can get something back out of it. All right, a fifth thing that's a byproduct of a materialistic mindset is when our money is rarely shared with others who are in need. So look at Luke chapter 16. And in Luke chapter 16, you read about the rich man and Lazarus. In verse 14, it says, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard these things and they derided him. Now, Jesus has just given another parable on the shrewd steward. And the Pharisees didn't like it. Why? Because they were lovers of money. And people who are lovers of money don't like it when people preach on money. And in verse 15, Jesus says, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. Now, notice what he goes on to talk about when you get to verse 19. He says, there was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen. Now, these were some of the most expensive clothing materials that you could buy in the first century. Purple was an expensive material because to get a purple fabric, you had to take a certain type of coloring that came from the ocean. You had to crush it to get the purple dye. It was a costly process. Fine linen was also very expensive. And so Jesus is painting a picture here of a person who was rich, clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. He ate well every single day. By the way, even on the Sabbath day. So this is someone who seems to have neglected the Sabbath because having people cook for you on the Sabbath was not right. Verse 20, it says, there was a certain beggar, though, named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate. He was desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table, or the word bread might be used. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Now, I want you to think about the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table for a minute, because this is a phrase that I don't think we understand as much. We think of this as, the little crumbs that just kind of fall on the plate. But in the first century, they didn't have napkins like we have. They obviously didn't have paper napkins. They didn't have paper towels. Do you know what rich people clean their hands with? Well, they took chunks of bread and they would eat with their hands. They weren't sitting there usually eating with spoons and forks and knives properly. They would just eat with their hands, so their hands got dirty. They were eating meat and greasy things. And so what did you wipe your hands with? You took a big chunk of bread, because bread was commonly made in first century homes every day. And you would take that bread and you would wipe your hands off with the bread, and then you would throw the bread on the ground. That's how rich you are. You got enough money, you can just throw bread on the ground. And Lazarus, full of sores, just wants some of those chunks of bread that were used to clean off the rich man's hands. In verse 22, so it was that the beggar died. He was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died, and he was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes. He saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. So what happens here? Well, I think we know probably the rest of the story, right? The rich man and Lazarus teaches us that the rich man neglected to use his abundant resources to help the beggar Lazarus who sat at his gate. And because of that, when the judgment time came, when both of them died, the rich man is suffering and being tormented in Hades, and Lazarus is being comforted in Abraham's bosom. Their situation has been reversed. What's the ultimate point that Jesus is making? He'll make several later, but the ultimate point right here is that God's purpose for money and our prosperity is not just for our own self-gratification. The rich man was condemned because he didn't look out for his fellow man. And he should have. God is going to judge us, by the way, for what we fail to do, and not just what we do. You know, the rich man, did you know you never read about him cursing Lazarus? He never walks by and kicks him. He never threatens him. He never says, call the police, escort this person, carry him off of my property. He never mocks Lazarus. So what did he do? It's not what he did, it's what he didn't do. The sin that he committed was what he omitted. He could have helped Lazarus consciously, and he never offered any help at all. God expects us to be mindful of his will in all of our plans. Other passages show us that we are going to be responsible for helping our neighbor with our resources. Matthew 25 is another one from Jesus, where, as you read there in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31, it talks about the final judgment there in Matthew 25. And it says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, all the holy angels sit with him. He will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him. He will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. He will set the sheep on his right hand. He will set the goats on his left hand. And the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say, assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. But what's he say to the people who didn't do that? The next verse says he's going to say to the people on his left hand, depart from me, you cursed. Why? Because you had the opportunity to help those who were sick, or those who were in prison, or those who didn't have proper clothes for the winter, or those who just needed some food, or those who just needed something to drink. You could have done little things just to look out for other people, and you didn't do it. And you're going to be held accountable for it. Why? Because you're covetous. Now, you know, we talk sometimes about what is a salvation issue or what is not a salvation issue. Let me tell you something. Helping other people is a salvation issue. I know that because Jesus said it. Jesus said, if you don't help people who are hungry and thirsty, people who are right in your midst that you know that you can help, people who don't have proper clothes. You know, sometimes you see kids where mom and dad are maybe struggling financially and their pants are too short. I've seen Christians go out because they see that and take kids shopping. They'll spend $300, $400, $500 at the store taking them shopping because they know mom and dad can't afford it. I can tell you that we've benefited my family. Things have been tight sometimes as a preacher, but we've been very blessed over the years where we've had people who said they've got tons and tons. I mean, people have given us bags and bags and bags full of clothes so that when my kids were growing and growing out of something else and growing some more, there are people who saw that. And we've always been so thankful for people who saw things like that. I've had sisters already, you know, Rachel yesterday packed up some food. That was my lunch today. She thought about, hey, you might want some lunch tomorrow. And then Pat did the same thing today. So you might want some lunch tomorrow. It's little, it's not that you have to be a donor and your name has to be on a plaque somewhere. It's just that if you see somebody who needs something, food, drink, something small, you took the time to help them. And Jesus says, when you help brethren in that way, you're helping me. Now, the reason why this is important is because God wants us to understand that the money that we make, the possessions that we have, that we're blessed with, that we have those things for a purpose. It's for helping one another. Ephesians 4:27, let him who stole steal no longer, let him labor, working with his hands, so that he might give to him who has need. One of the purposes. I like this poem, and I'm going to finish with this poem here today. It's called God Won't Ask. And maybe you've heard this. This has been passed around some, but I like it because I think it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about. God won't ask what kind of car you drove, but he will ask how many people you drove who didn't have transportation. God won't ask the square footage of your house, but he will ask how many people you welcomed into your home. God won't ask about the fancy clothes you had in your closet, but he will ask how many of those clothes helped the needy. God won't ask how many material possessions you had, but he will ask if they dictated your life. God won't ask what your highest salary was, but he will ask if you compromised your character to obtain that salary. God won't ask how much overtime you worked, but he will ask if you worked overtime for your family and loved ones. God won't ask what your job title was, but he will ask if you performed your job to the best of your ability. God won't ask what you did to help yourself. He will ask what you did to help others. God won't ask what neighborhood you lived in. He will ask how you treated your neighbors. I like that. It gets to the heart of what we're talking about. Well, how do we overcome materialism? We need to understand stewardship. We need to understand stewardship. And very briefly, just so you can fill in those blanks, in Matthew 25, it gives us the parable of the talents. And there's 4 principles of stewardship that we want to notice there. The first principle is this in the parable of talents: God owns it all. I need to understand that I'm actually not the owner of everything. God is. And he's just allowing me to use these resources while I'm here on earth for his glory. God owns it all. God expects faithfulness with what he's given me. And so the 5-talent man, when he multiplied it, God appreciated that. He did something with what God had blessed him with. The 2-talent man, when he turned it into 4, God appreciated that. He says, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joys of your Lord. He did something with what God had blessed him with, something positive. And the amount to God, principle number 3, the amount he entrusts to us is irrelevant. Doesn't matter if you've been blessed as a millionaire and a billionaire, or if you're somebody who's just kind of making ends meet every single week. Whether you were the 1-talent man, the 2-talent man, or the 5-talent man in Scripture, God expected every single one of those people to do the best they can with what they had. And so God just asked you to be a good steward of what you have. He's not going to compare what you had to what somebody else had, but what you had, God wants you to do the best that you can with it for him. And with talents, time, with ability, with money, come responsibility and action. The 1-talent man, what did he do with his talent? He buried it in the ground. He did nothing with it. And God says to him, you wicked and lazy servant. God was disappointed in him because he didn't do anything with what God gave him. We've got to do something with what God has given us as we get ready for the day of reckoning. We've got to understand we're stewards of what God has given us. And so one final question from Jesus as you think about materialism. Let Jesus ask the final question. Jesus, as he's thinking about this subject from the Gospel of Mark's perspective, Mark records in chapter 8, verse 36, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? And I'll leave you with that question. Jesus very clearly speaks to the problem of materialism there. Don't be so interested in your material, physical, monetary pursuits that you forget about your own soul. We are so materially blessed in this life. If you've never been overseas, you may not realize that. But I promise you, if you were to go overseas and if you were to see some of the things that I've seen in other places, you come home and you realize we are so blessed here. We are so lucky to live in the country that we live in, despite everybody's complaints out there, because we are so prosperous and blessed. But let's realize that for what it is. It is God giving us opportunities as Christians to do his will with our blessings. Let's do the best we can to do that. If you have not been putting first things first in your life and you need to start making spiritual things your priority, realizing that that's the best return on your investment that you could possibly make in this life, then we would encourage you, if you want to come forward and confess or obey the gospel here this evening, why don't you come do that while together we stand and while we sing.